The first thing Caleb Turner noticed that summer was the sound of the river changing. For as long as he could remember, the Arroyo Verde had spoken in a steady voice, a confident rush that promised life to both banks. It cut between his ranch and the land across the water like an old boundary carved by nature itself, and for decades that boundary had also marked rivalry. His father had warned him about the people across the river, calling them stubborn, territorial, and impossible. Caleb had grown up believing it was an old family feud with no clear beginning, only a tradition of distrust passed down like worn saddles and cracked fence posts. But that summer, the river no longer rushed. It whispered, then sighed, and finally fell almost silent, exposing stones that had never seen the sun. The drought crept in quietly at first, burning the grass yellow, shrinking the cattle's grazing fields, and forcing Caleb to count every drop of water as if it were gold dust slipping through his fingers. Across the river lived his rival, though he had never truly seen her until that year. He had always assumed the neighboring ranch belonged to a man, someone rough and broad-shouldered like himself, someone he could curse under his breath when fences broke or water levels dropped. But one morning, riding along the dry riverbed to inspect the damage, Caleb saw her. She stood on the opposite bank, hat pulled low, sleeves rolled up, boots sunk into cracked mud. She moved with confidence, directing a small crew as they adjusted pipes and measured what little water remained. Even from a distance, he could tell there was nothing fragile about her. This was not the rival he had imagined, and the realization unsettled him more than he expected. Her name, he would later learn, was Elena Morales. The Morales Ranch had been in her family for generations, just like the Turner Ranch had been in his. She had returned after her father's death to save what remained of the land, leaving behind a career in agricultural engineering that had taken her far from this river. Now she was back, fighting the same drought, facing the same impossible choices. But on that first morning, all Caleb knew was that the person across the river who had always been the enemy was a woman with sharp eyes and a steady gaze, someone who did not look away when she noticed him watching. The drought worsened with every passing week. Wells ran shallow, pumps groaned in protest, and cattle grew restless. Caleb tried everything he knew, rotating grazing fields, selling off weaker stock, praying for rain that never came. At night, he lay awake listening to the wind scrape dry branches against the house, wondering how much longer he could hold on. Pride had always been his armor, the belief that a Turner never asked for help, especially not from the other side of the river. But pride did not fill water troughs, and it did not keep animals alive. One afternoon, after losing 2 calves to dehydration, Caleb rode to the river with a knot in his stomach and a decision he had been avoiding. Elena was there again, studying the river with a notebook in hand. When Caleb cleared his throat, she turned, surprise flickering across her face before settling into cautious curiosity. The silence between them felt heavier than the heat. He introduced himself, awkwardly, feeling foolish for never having done so before. She nodded, already knowing his name, and said it plainly, without bitterness or warmth. They spoke about the drought at first, about rainfall charts and water tables, about how the river had never been this low in living memory. The conversation stayed practical, safe, until Caleb finally said what he had come to say. He told her he could not make it alone. He admitted that the river, thin as it was still the only lifeline for both their ranches, and that fighting over it would destroy them faster than the drought ever could. Elena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked back at the river, then at him, as if weighing not just his words but the generations of rivalry behind them. She said she had been thinking the same thing but doubted he would ever cross the river to talk. Her honesty surprised him, disarmed him. She proposed sharing water through a coordinated system, alternating usage times, installing temporary infrastructure to reduce waste. It would require trust, cooperation, and constant communication, things neither family had ever practiced with the other. Caleb hesitated only a moment before agreeing, knowing there was no real choice left. The days that followed were some of the hardest Caleb had ever known, not because of the physical labor, though there was plenty of that, but because of the mental shift required. Working side by side with Elena meant confronting every assumption he had inherited. She was knowledgeable, decisive, and unafraid to challenge his ideas when they conflicted with data. At first, He bristled at her corrections, feeling his authority threatened on his own land. But she never spoke down to him, never mocked his experience. Instead, she explained, demonstrated, and listened in return. Slowly, grudgingly, Caleb found himself respecting her not just as a neighbor, but as a partner. They spent long days laying pipes, repairing old channels, and monitoring flow rates. The sun burned their skin, dust coated their clothes, and exhaustion blurred the edges of their vision. Yet in those shared hardships, something unexpected grew. Conversations stretched beyond water and cattle, drifting into stories about childhood, about parents and expectations, about the weight of legacy. Caleb learned how Elena's father had taught her to read the land like a language, how she had fought to be taken seriously in a world that doubted her because she was a woman. Elena learned how Caleb had stayed when his siblings left, how he had chosen responsibility over freedom without ever calling it a sacrifice. One evening, after a particularly brutal day, they sat on the riverbank watching the sky turn orange and purple. The water glimmered weakly, but it still moved, still lived. Elena spoke about leaving again if the ranch failed, about the fear that haunted her despite her confidence. Caleb admitted he had never imagined a life beyond this land, that the thought of losing it felt like losing himself. In that quiet moment, with the river between them no longer a boundary but a shared responsibility, they felt closer than either expected. Not everyone welcomed their cooperation. Workers on both ranches whispered, old neighbors shook their heads, and distant relatives warned of betrayal. Caleb heard echoes of his father's voice telling him never to trust the Morales family. Elena faced similar pressure, accused of weakness for negotiating instead of fighting. There were days when the stress pushed them to argue, when fatigue sharpened every word into a weapon. But each time, they returned to the river, to the simple truth that survival depended on unity. Then, just when hope had settled into cautious routine, disaster struck. A section of the shared pipeline collapsed during the night, spilling precious water into the sand. By the time they discovered it, the loss was devastating. Accusations flew from both sides, tempers flared, and the fragile trust they had built threatened to shatter. Caleb felt anger surge, old instincts screaming that this was proof cooperation had been a mistake. Elena stood her ground, insisting on inspecting the damage before assigning blame. Together, they worked through the night to repair it, hands raw and minds racing. As dawn broke, they discovered the cause was not negligence but a hidden fault in the ground, something neither could have predicted. The relief that followed was mixed with something deeper. Exhausted and dirty, they laughed, the sound surprising them both. It was the laughter of people who had been pushed to the edge and found they were stronger together. From that moment, the last walls between them began to fall. They trusted each other not just with water, but with fears, plans, and dreams. Caleb realized he looked forward to Elena's presence, to her voice calling out measurements, to the way she smiled when a solution worked. Elena found comfort in Caleb's steadiness, his quiet determination, his willingness to learn and adapt. When the rains finally came, they were sudden and violent, drenching the land as if making up for months of absence. The river swelled, roaring back to life, reclaiming its voice. Fields drank deeply, cattle lowed in relief, and the land breathed again. Standing together in the rain, soaked and laughing, Caleb and Elena felt a joy that went beyond survival. They had not just saved their ranches, they had changed the course of a feud that had lasted longer than either of them. In the months that followed, their partnership became permanent. They invested in sustainable water management, shared resources, and planned for future droughts together. The community, once skeptical, began to see the benefits. Other ranchers asked for advice, inspired by what cooperation had achieved. Caleb and Elena's relationship deepened naturally, rooted not in drama, but in shared struggle and respect. Love grew quietly, like grass after rain, undeniable in its persistence. One evening, a year after the drought broke, Caleb stood on the riverbank again, watching the water flow strong and clear. Elena joined him, slipping her hand into his. The river no longer divided their lands in his mind. It connected them. It carried the memory of hardship, the lesson of humility, and the promise of shared future. Caleb realized then that rivalry had nearly cost them everything, but drought had forced them to see each other as they truly were. In sharing water, they had shared hearts, and in doing so, they had found something far more enduring than land or legacy. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you believe in second chances and unlikely love, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more powerful stories that prove even the hardest seasons can lead to the most beautiful endings.